Please help me welcome to the stage, Dawn Holly Johnson.
In 2016, 300 people died worldwide in commercial aviation incidents out of 3.5 billion passengers that traveled that year. So statistically, what that means is you have a much better chance of ever winning the lottery than dying in a plane accident. But when a plane accident occurs, it's all over the media. And we're shocked and dismayed, and we demand to know the cause of failure. And that's a good thing. We hold the aviation industry accountable to prevent future accidents. And due to this widespread accountability, we are able to have them strive for perfection, and they have an amazing safety record to show for it. As a former aerospace process engineer, I find it odd when I'm in the airport and people complain about their flight being delayed. I mean, I know there are well-designed processes and well-thought-out checks and balances to assure safe flight. There's a darn good reason that flight's delayed. And I'm really thankful they're changing that part out. And I'm really thankful we're grounded until the weather clears. There are literally a million processes in place to make sure that you do not become a statistic. Now let's turn our attention to healthcare. In the year 2016, medical error became the third leading cause of death in the United States. This represents over 250,000 preventable deaths, and it's an under-recognized cause of death, which means these numbers are low. The loss of life due to medical error is equivalent to 3 commercial jetliners crashing with all lives lost every single day. If you woke up to that on the news, how well would you tolerate it? Yet we rarely hear about medical error on the news. And perhaps it's time we hold the healthcare industry accountable like we do the aviation industry. So why is there such a difference in performance between these two industries? Well, healthcare is expertise-focused. The aviation industry is customer-focused and process-driven with an engineering mindset. And process engineering is at the core of this practice. Process engineering, by definition, is the designing of business processes to create dramatic improvement in productivity and quality, and it's all while focusing on delivering better value to the customer. Expertise-driven is just that. It focuses primarily on the expert and then the customer and process. So think about it. Would you like your pilot to ignore his pre-flight checklist prior to takeoff? I mean, he's flown so many times, surely you'd be comfortable with relying on his memory. Of course not, right? We are humans and therefore imperfect. We want that pilot to perform those checks and balances every single time. And so as part of due process, he's actually held accountable by many to perform this step. And this is an example of one of the critical processes designed and engineered for the aviation industry to assure safe flight. Conversely, we allow healthcare providers to diagnose and treat us every day without the rigors equivalent of the aerospace industry. We as patients often trust that they will consider everything about our health, our history, our lifestyle, ask every question pertinent to treating us. And after diagnosis, there are typically limited checks and balances in place to validate a healthcare provider's decisions. As patients, we are also guilty for not holding healthcare providers to account. For instance, I often hear about people getting second opinions, but yet how many really do that? We actually assume the healthcare provider's expertise is enough. So why isn't the pilot's expertise enough? Humans make mistakes. Preventing them is key. It takes well-engineered processes with focus on the customer to prevent failure. In healthcare, everything revolves around healthcare professionals' expertise and routine. It's how it's been designed, and it is far from being patient-focused and process-driven. And here's an example of the impact. Bob is due for his annual physical, so he calls to make an appointment with his doctor, and he's told he can't get an appointment for 3 weeks. And on the day of the examination, the doctor asks him a few questions and writes up a routine blood draw and sends Bob on his way. Bob gets his blood drawn, and a week later he gets a call from the doctor. He's being sent to a urologist because Bob has stage 1 prostate cancer. It takes 3 weeks to get into the urologist. We caught it early, Bob. We've got a couple options. We can treat it with radiation, or we can remove your prostate. So Bob chooses the latter. 3 months after diagnosis, it's the day for surgery. And it's a success. And Bob's elated. I mean, the cancer's gone. And that evening, he has an amazing visit with both his daughters. He's going to be released the next day. The next morning, Bob's daughter gets a call. Your father suffered a massive stroke overnight, and we're afraid we didn't catch it until this morning. As Bob's daughters arrive at the hospital, the neurologist is waiting, and he's performed a simple ultrasound on Bob's carotid arteries, and he's found a blockage. And all it took was a little blood clot from that surgery to block that major artery that fed Bob's brain. Bob is almost entirely paralyzed on the left-hand side, and the neurologist is furious. I could have prevented this, he says, and he storms out of the hospital room. The urologist shows up a little bit later, and one of Bob's daughters says, "Isn't it standard care to check a 66-year-old man's arteries prior to elective surgery? Don't you know his mother died from multiple strokes?" He dropped his head. He didn't know. And he was very, truly sorry. And Bob lived for 5 years, having trouble speaking, eating, and walking. His left neglect had him see half the world. He lost complete sense of time and his witty sense of humor. And his young granddaughters felt uncomfortable around him because he just wasn't grandpa anymore. Bob died in 2006. His daughters miss him every day. I miss him every day. I'm one of Bob's daughters. What happened here? Well, there were the typical delays in care that we've all become accustomed to. There was lack of communication between Dad's primary physician and the urologist and Dad, including vital family history. There were lax of checks and balances to make sure Dad was healthy enough for this invasive surgery, which could have included an ultrasound on his arteries to make sure they were clear. It could have been monitoring his brain overnight after surgery to make sure that a stroke didn't occur or that they could catch it quickly. But there's simply a lack of an end-to-end process that holds anybody accountable for his entire healthcare journey to be successful. While my father was in long-term care, I knew I could make a difference, so I left aerospace and I went to work in healthcare. And I worked in healthcare for 8 years, and I can tell you that healthcare providers are well-intentioned, and they work hard, and they take care of us. But without well-designed processes, engineered to prevent failure with the patient in mind, they are working at a distinct disadvantage for saving lives. I have experienced the work some health systems have performed to design processes focused on patients' well-being where they've reduced the average treatment time in the emergency room from 7.5 hours to 1.5 hours. I can't tell you how important speed of care is in an emergent situation. Plus, all the health providers' time was better spent and the operating costs were reduced. Through process engineering of operating room sterilization procedures, we reduced post-surgery staph infections by 50%. 1.7 million people acquire a staph infection in the hospital every year. 99,000 die. If we applied this process across all operating rooms in the United States, we'd save 50,000 lives annually. In business, a lack of well-defined engineered processes focused on the customer will waste time, money, and I'll guarantee you to satisfy your customers. But in some industries, lack of those processes has dire consequence. So I'm thankful today that more and more organizations are beginning to discover that experts only perform as well as the process they follow. Or as so aptly coined by a forefather of process engineering, W. Edwards D. Deming, it's not enough to do your best. You must know what to do, and then do your best. Thank you.